in the small, isolated town of Devil's Fork, North Dakota. Whispers of the past hung thick in the air, much like the dust that clung to the worn wooden planks of the old Carter house. The town had never quite recovered from the trauma of the Civil War. Its once bustling streets now a barren reminder of lives lost and futures altered. Amidst this decay stood the Carter house, a decaying monument to forgotten horrors. Its dark windows seemed to watch over the town like unblinking eyes, reflecting a past steeped in blood and suffering. For years the house had stood empty, its walls echoing with the stories of those who had once lived there. But the rumors never stopped. Some said the house was cursed, others believed it was alive, feeding off the pain of those who came too close. It was a place no one dared visit after dark, and even in the daylight its presence felt oppressive, like a shadow that refused to lift. Yet there were those who were drawn to its dark history as if the house called to them, luring them to uncover its secrets. Sarah Lawson, a journalist from Minneapolis, was one of those drawn in. She had heard the stories, read the fragmented reports from the past, and felt the irresistible urge to uncover the truth. Her curiosity was more than just professional. There was a deep, unsettling pull that led her to Devil's Fork. She had come to investigate, to unearth the origins of the house's dark reputation. What had really happened in those rooms beneath the roof that had been a silent witness to so many disappearances, so many deaths? Sarah arrived in the town with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. The locals were tight-lipped, as though speaking of the house brought some kind of curse down upon them. Sarah knew she would have to dig deeper, but even as she introduced herself to the few residents who still remembered the Carter family, she felt the cold weight of their eyes on her, as if they could sense the danger she was courting. Her first stop was the old town library, its shelves filled with brittle newspapers and yellowing books that seemed to groan under the weight of time. The librarian, a frail woman named Mrs. Bellamy, gave Sarah a hesitant nod when she asked about the Carter house. "It's not a place you want to go poking around," Mrs. Bellamy whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling pages. "People went missing there. You'd be better off leaving it alone, miss." But Sarah wasn't easily deterred. She smiled politely and thanked Mrs. Bellamy, though something in her words made the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stand on end. The woman's fear was palpable, as if the mere mention of the house was enough to summon something out of the past. Sarah spent the rest of the day combing through the library's records, piecing together the scattered remnants of the Carter family's history. She found little to explain the rumors, just the basic facts. Jonathan Carter, a wealthy landowner, had built the house in the late 1850s, soon after settling in Devil's Fork. His wife, Mary, and their two children, Thomas and Eliza, had lived there until one by one they vanished. The authorities had never been able to uncover what had happened to them, and as time passed, the town moved on. But the house remained, standing like a tombstone in the middle of a forgotten town, its walls silently screaming the secrets it held. The deeper Sarah delved into the town's past, the more unsettling the accounts became. Old journal entries hidden away in dusty corners of the library spoke of strange occurrences within the house during the Civil War. Soldiers passing through had reported hearing cries in the night, whispers in empty rooms, and the sensation of being watched when there was no one there. Some claimed to have seen shadows flitting across the windows, figures that were never fully seen but always present. Others spoke of an altar hidden somewhere within the house where unspeakable rituals had been performed. These were the kind of stories that chilled the bones, stories of a house that was far from empty, far from abandoned. The more Sarah read, the more the weight of the house's past pressed down on her. Each page seemed to draw her in further, and despite the fear that gnawed at her gut, she knew she couldn't stop now. She had to know what had happened here, to uncover the truth behind the disappearances. She had come to Devil's Fork to write a story, but what she was uncovering was something far darker than anything she could have imagined. The Carter house was more than just a building. It was a place where something had gone terribly wrong. A place where the line between the living and the dead had blurred, and Sarah was now standing on the edge of that abyss. The house's secrets were waiting for her, and as she closed the last journal, the room seemed to grow colder, the silence more oppressive. Sarah looked at the door, half expecting to see someone or something watching her from the other side. Sarah's investigation into the Carter house led her into a labyrinth of half-remembered horrors, stories that had been whispered so quietly they almost seemed like imagination. She learned of Jonathan Carter, the man whose public face was that of a respectable landowner. Generous to neighbors and patrons alike, a man who would smile at a visitor while hiding the sick truths of his household behind closed doors. The Carter children, Thomas and Eliza, had vanished without explanation, and the townsfolk spoke in trembling tones of small skeletal remains that had been found near the house years later. Bones that did not appear to belong to any creature in the known world, as if they had been broken and reassembled in ways that mocked the human body. Sarah uncovered old sketches hidden in Jonathan Carter's ledger, crude drawings of figures suspended in cages, elongated and bent at impossible angles with symbols etched into their skin. Spirals and sigils that hinted at a knowledge of suffering that went far beyond cruelty into something almost mechanical. A calculated precision in torment that she could not unsee. The ledger detailed rituals in an almost clinical tone, describing nights where the family would gather by candlelight, chanting incomprehensible phrases, their faces calm, smiles painted across their mouths while the children were restrained in silent agony. Sarah felt her stomach twist as she read the accounts of the servants who had worked in the house, some who had disappeared themselves, others who had fled in terror, claiming that Jonathan Carter had spoken of hearing voices that guided his hands, teaching him how to create suffering that was pure, lasting, necessary. These were not haphazard acts of madness. There was a method, a reasoning so alien that it defied understanding. As Sarah walked through the empty streets of Devil's Fork later that evening, the shadows of the Carter house stretched long across the ground, and she felt for the first time the sensation of being measured by unseen eyes. Something about the house seemed alive, as if it knew she had begun to see it for what it was, that her curiosity had placed her squarely in its path. The townsfolk avoided the subject whenever she pressed them, offering vague references to the family's curse. But Sarah could see the fear in their eyes, a fear that they did not trust even to name. She felt it too, the undercurrent of something that had left a stain across the land and lingered in the wind. That night, she returned to the library and found a small dust-covered box tucked beneath the ledger, filled with brittle letters and newspaper clippings. Each document reinforced what she had read in the journals. Disappearances coinciding with the family's darkest experiments, neighbors who had grown ill after brief visits, and reports of screams in the night that were dismissed by the authorities as superstition. But Sarah knew better. She could sense the careful, deliberate design behind the horror. There was an intelligence in the suffering, an obsession with order and secrecy, a mind that took pride in its work. That night, as the wind howled across the empty streets of Devil's Fork, Sarah could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. The house loomed over the town like a sentinel, and in the darkness she imagined the eyes of Jonathan Carter, cold and precise, observing her from the shadows, assessing her worth, determining how she would fit into the story of suffering he had begun all those years ago. She left the library carrying the documents carefully, her hands trembling, not from the cold but from the weight of the knowledge she had uncovered. The first bones had been discovered not in the ground but in the legacy of a family whose obsession with suffering had left a permanent scar. Sarah felt the pulse of dread in her chest, knowing she had only begun to understand the depth of evil that had been hidden behind the Carter family's veneer of normalcy, and that the house itself, as if alive, would not relinquish its secrets so easily. Sarah returned to the Carter house the following morning, the chill in the air biting through her coat, a reminder that the land itself seemed to reject human presence. The house stood as it always had, warped by time, yet rigid in its imposing silence, as though it had grown aware of her investigations. Every detail, from the warped staircase to the warped floorboards, suggested the deliberate hand of someone who took satisfaction in control. Jonathan Carter, she realized, had not simply committed acts of cruelty. He had built them into the very architecture of the home. The rooms themselves seemed designed to contain suffering, angles that trapped sound, hallways that twisted disorientation into fear. Ceilings low in some areas, high in others, designed so that no footstep was predictable, no shadow trustworthy. Sarah moved cautiously, taking careful notes, her flashlight revealing walls scratched with marks of unknown origin, patterns that suggested more than mere children's games. They were instructions, warnings, perhaps even remnants of a ritual, etched by a hand that knew the weight of time and the power of anticipation. In one room she found a small hidden door leading to a basement that smelled of damp and decay. As she descended, her heart pounded not with adrenaline but with the realization of being drawn into a space where calculation met obsession. The basement contained remnants of instruments whose purpose could only be inferred through conjecture. Metal clamps, glass vessels, and thin strips of material that appeared to be both organic and treated, preserved in a way that suggested a methodical, almost scientific cruelty. These were the tools of someone who believed in shaping suffering, who believed that pain had a geometry and a rhythm. Sarah could almost hear the quiet hum of purpose that must have guided Jonathan Carter's actions. A slow and steady pulse that demanded precision. She imagined the family moving through the halls in silence, performing rituals that required not only obedience but reverence. And in that silence, the children's compliance was enforced not through threats alone, but through an internalization of dread. The more she explored, the more the house seemed to respond to her presence. The air grew heavier, as if each room remembered past horrors and had learned to resist intrusions. Sarah felt her thoughts crowding together, unbidden visions of bodies suspended or contorted according to plans she could barely comprehend. Rituals that blurred the line between sacrifice and architecture, discipline and madness. It was not chaos, she realized, but order. Every disappearance, every whispered scream had been part of a larger design. Jonathan Carter had been a silent architect, not just of a house, but of a system of terror, one that left an imprint on the building itself. She documented every detail, every anomaly, the depressions in the floor where furniture had been moved in patterns, the scorched marks that suggested candlelight rituals, the tiny holes in the walls that allowed observation without being seen. Each artifact spoke of a mind obsessed with controlling not just bodies but perception, with shaping fear into a tangible, repeatable process. Sarah's mind refused to rest. She began to piece together a profile of Carter's psyche, a man who understood that true cruelty required patience, subtlety, and the illusion of normalcy. To the outside world, he was a respectable landowner. Within the house, he was a conductor of suffering, each movement deliberate, each silence meaningful. She shivered, realizing the house had been an extension of his mind, the walls a recording of acts that could never be undone. By the time she left, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the facade of the Carter house, elongating the building into something almost unnatural. Sarah felt the weight of observation, as if the house itself had eyes trained on her, judging the depth of her understanding. She carried her notes back to her temporary lodgings, aware that the more she uncovered, the more the house would demand of her. The silent architect had left a blueprint of terror, etched not on paper alone but into the very fabric of the building, a reminder that evil could be both methodical and hidden in plain sight. And as Sarah sat reviewing her findings, she realized that the house, the architect, and the town of Devil's Fork were inseparable, bound together by a history of whispered horrors that refused to die, each revelation pulling her further into a darkness she was no longer sure she could escape. The next morning, Sarah returned to the Carter house with a determination sharpened by unease. The previous day's discoveries had left her unsettled, but curiosity outweighed fear. She had learned that Jonathan Carter had constructed more than walls and staircases. He had designed spaces that could manipulate perception, control sound, and isolate his victims. Today, she intended to examine what the journals referred to only obliquely: the chambers of illumination, places where light itself became part of the terror. Pushing open the heavy front door, she felt the familiar resistance of air that seemed unwilling to let her in. The floorboards groaned under her weight, each creak echoing through the empty house like a reminder that every step was being measured. In the farthest wing of the building, she discovered a set of narrow doors, concealed behind a rotting curtain, leading to rooms that smelled faintly of wax and scorched wood. Her flashlight revealed dozens of half-melted candles positioned on intricate iron stands that bent light into jagged patterns on the walls. Shadows danced across the room as she stepped closer, their movement almost rhythmic, as if they were orchestrated by an unseen hand. The journals had described rituals that required hours of patience, ceremonies in which the flicker of flame dictated the victim's torment, the positioning of light amplifying fear, casting reflections that disoriented the mind. Sarah traced the scorched marks on the floor and ceiling, noting the precision with which every candle had been placed. It was as though Jonathan Carter had studied the psychology of fear, translating it into angles, distances, and intensity. Somewhere in the room, a narrow slit in the wall allowed observation without being noticed, a spy hole for a man who considered voyeurism a form of discipline. She imagined the children standing at the center of the room, forced to endure the long hours of trembling shadows, the subtle movements of light designed to warp their perception, to make each second stretch into eternity. The flickering flames created illusions of movement where none existed, whispered shapes of phantom figures that seemed alive, forcing the mind to question its own senses. As Sarah stepped further inside, she noticed remnants of substances on the floor, powders that had long since dried into brittle crusts, and traces of oils that smelled faintly metallic. The journals had hinted at their use in rituals meant to heighten sensory deprivation, to make the mind more pliable to fear. Sarah's stomach churned at the thought, realizing that Carter's cruelty was both ritualistic and experimental. He had treated suffering as both a craft and a study, measuring reactions, cataloging terror, learning how to shape it with methodical care. She took careful photographs and notes, careful not to disturb the fragile remnants, knowing that every artifact was a piece of the puzzle of a mind so detached from empathy that normal understanding failed. Time seemed to stretch in the room, and she felt herself shivering not only from cold, but from the weight of inherited dread, as if the candles themselves had retained the terror of those who had stood before them decades earlier. Each shadow seemed to whisper, telling her that the house was not empty, that the past had not yet released its hold. Sarah understood in a visceral way that the rituals of light were more than cruelty. They were training in fear itself, a lesson in obedience and internalized terror designed to bend the human mind. She left the chambers reluctantly, documenting every detail, aware that she had crossed another threshold in understanding the Carter family's methods. Outside, the sun was low, washing the house in a pale orange light, softening the edges of the horrors within. And yet she knew that inside, the darkness remained absolute, preserved in wax, shadow, and memory. As she walked back to her lodgings, the image of flickering flames and suspended shapes lingered in her mind, a haunting prelude to deeper horrors yet to be uncovered. Sarah's research had led her to a series of overlooked details, fragments that had been dismissed by townsfolk as rumor or superstition. She discovered that the Carter house had not only contained its immediate family, but had been a revolving door of servants, many of whom had vanished without trace. Letters from neighboring towns mentioned staff who had been hired by Jonathan Carter only to leave abruptly, claiming illness, exhaustion, or some private crisis too shameful to name. The journals provided another far more disturbing perspective. They described servants bound into the household's secret machinery of fear, forced to maintain rituals, light candles in precise formations, clean instruments that hinted at unspeakable uses, and observe without question. Failure, the journals noted in a detached tone, was not merely punished. It was recorded, measured, and incorporated into the ongoing study of control. Sarah felt the hairs on her neck stand on end as she read an entry describing a young maid, Mary, who had attempted to leave after weeks of observing the ceremonies. Jonathan Carter had written that he allowed her a final walk through the gardens. But that evening she had disappeared entirely, leaving only her shoes behind, neatly placed as if waiting for her return. The journals detailed similar incidents with a tone of scientific precision. Servants instructed in silence, removed from the world when curiosity or weakness threatened to interfere, their absence noted. Yet the house itself remained indifferent. Sarah began tracing the servant pathways through the house, the kitchens, hidden staircases, and storage rooms that led to spaces nobody could explain. Each space suggested that the Carter family had treated human labor as a pliable tool, something to manipulate as they did the children, bending obedience with calculated dread. One account described a servant being forced to clean a room whose walls were coated with a substance meant to distort smell, forcing nausea while performing menial tasks for hours. The ritual was repeated nightly, and eventually the servant became a ghost in their own body, mind collapsing under relentless, meticulous cruelty. Sarah felt a hollow ache in her chest as she read of another maid, Thomasina, who had been trapped in a room of mirrors with candlelight arranged to cast her reflections into infinite distorted forms. She had begun to scream incoherently within days, her voice echoing against the glass until the journals recorded only silence. The systematic elimination of those who served was not random but purposeful. Each disappearance reinforced the hierarchy of fear, the supremacy of the Carter mind over any witness, any human life that might defy its control. Sarah imagined walking the hallways herself, sensing invisible instructions etched into the walls, feeling the same careful observation that had guided the servants, a mind evaluating every hesitation, every breath. She realized that the house had trained the servants in terror, shaping them into silent accomplices, or erasing them when they failed, leaving behind only traces that would haunt anyone who sought to investigate. By nightfall, she could no longer distinguish the difference between architecture and psychology, between the deliberate cruelty of a man and the atmosphere of the building itself. Every creaking floorboard, every shadow became evidence that the Carter family's evil had been structural, both physical and psychic. As she left the house, Sarah paused at the edge of the property, staring back at the darkened windows. The wind carried a faint rustle, the echo of steps that should not exist, and she shivered at the thought that even after more than 30 years, the house still remembered the vanished. The servants had disappeared, leaving no bodies, no closure, only the impression of meticulous, unseen hands shaping reality around them. Sarah knew she was only beginning to understand the scale of methodical horror Jonathan Carter had orchestrated. The echoes of absence were themselves a message, a lesson in fear and a warning. The house demanded silence, compliance, and obedience. And anyone who entered its domain became part of the system, willingly or not. Sarah had long suspected that the true heart of the Carter house's darkness lay not in its walls or shadows, but in the writings Jonathan Carter had left behind. On this visit, she focused on the library, a room that had been sealed for decades, its door warped but not locked, as if the house itself allowed access to those it deemed worthy. The shelves were coated with dust, books untouched, but her fingers brushed against a small panel hidden behind the bottom row. It gave way to a shallow compartment, and inside were journals bound in faded leather, each page filled with meticulous handwriting, diagrams, and obscure notations. Sarah opened the first journal and found entries detailing experiments in obedience, perception, and endurance. Carter had studied the human mind as a scientist studies a specimen. Each reaction catalogued, each failure recorded, each moment of terror measured with precision. There were descriptions of punishment so particular they were almost ritualistic. One page detailed how a child's fingers were gently restrained and exposed to extreme cold for hours, each minute noted to see the threshold at which panic overcame rational thought. Another entry described the use of mirrors and candlelight to fracture self-perception, creating a disorientation so profound that the mind began to invent horrors where none existed. The entries were chilling not only for their content but for their tone. Carter wrote clinically devoid of empathy, referring to victims as subjects, and noting emotional responses as if evaluating a mathematical formula. Sarah shivered at a passage describing the removal of a servant for failing to maintain proper silence during a ritual. The body was never recovered, but Carter recorded the impact of the absence on the remaining staff, the cascading effects of fear and submission. Hidden in the journals were also sketches, floor plans of the house with annotations that indicated hidden doors, trap-like structures, and observation points designed to watch without being seen. The diagrams revealed a terrifying calculus. Every room, hallway, and staircase had a purpose, and every human within the building was part of an orchestrated experiment in control. Sarah realized that the house had not simply witnessed cruelty. It had been designed to facilitate it, to amplify the mind of its creator. The journals also hinted at a belief in something beyond mere physical manipulation. Carter wrote cryptically of harvesting fear as substance, and of moments when terror could be used to shape reality itself, blurring the line between method and superstition. The more she read, the more Sarah felt the weight of accumulated evil pressing against her thoughts. It was as if Carter had left a blueprint not just of actions but of a philosophy, a doctrine of control and calculated suffering that transcended time. She felt herself trembling, aware that holding these journals was to touch the mind of a man who had concealed darkness behind civility, who had built systems of suffering into the very walls around him. Each page seemed to whisper, each diagram a silent command, reinforcing the impression that the house itself had been an instrument of his will. When she finally closed the last journal, Sarah realized she had spent hours in the library, though it had felt like minutes. She carried the journals carefully, aware that they contained more than history. They contained a methodology, an insight into a mind capable of orchestrating horror without leaving physical traces, a mind that operated with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of a philosopher. Outside, the wind swept across the property, rustling dead leaves and carrying the faintest echo of old screams. Sarah understood that her investigation was no longer merely academic. She had touched the architecture of evil, held the notes of a mind that had structured terror as carefully as a builder lays bricks, and she knew that each revelation would demand more of her. pulled her further into the intricate, methodical darkness that Jonathan Carter had left behind. By the time Sarah returned to the Carter house the following morning, she felt as if she were approaching a living entity rather than a building. Every step into the vestibule carried the weight of history and dread, and the very air seemed to hum with memory. She had read of secret passages and hidden observation points, but today she was intent on tracing the literal echoes that haunted the structure. The journals had mentioned that certain walls were hollowed, designed to carry sound in ways that amplified whispers, footsteps, and cries, allowing a single observer to monitor multiple rooms without being seen. Sarah pressed her ear against the nearest wall, expecting only the faint creak of old wood, but she heard more. Distant scratching, muffled footsteps, even the faintest sighs that seemed to have been preserved in the house's timber. She moved methodically, running her hands along the walls, tapping to gauge resonance, listening for subtle differences that indicated a cavity or hidden passage. One section of the house produced a hollow note under her touch, and she found a panel near the staircase that gave way with little resistance. Inside was a narrow corridor, barely wide enough to crawl, lined with dust and old scraps of paper. The journals had described these corridors as observation vanes, designed so that the watcher could see and hear without being seen, to understand fear as it unfolded in real time. Sarah imagined Jonathan Carter moving through these spaces invisible, cataloging reactions, adjusting rituals, deciding who would remain and who would vanish. Her stomach twisted as she thought of the victims pressed into the rooms above and beside her, subjected to invisible eyes and ears, their lives manipulated like pieces on a board. The corridor opened into a small chamber, walls pocked with old nails and hooks, remnants of devices whose purposes were now lost to time but whose intent was unmistakable. There were faint stains on the wood, darkened areas that suggested prolonged use, a record of suffering absorbed by the very material. She realized that the house had been an accomplice, amplifying Carter's influence through architecture itself, embedding fear into floorboards, beams, and plaster. Each echo that returned to her ears seemed to carry fragments of the past, muffled sobs, hurried steps, whispered warnings, even the low, incomprehensible hum of someone held too long in isolation. Sarah's hands shook as she traced the wall, trying to imagine the mechanisms, the design, the careful orchestration of terror. The house had made the invisible visible, the unheard audible, and in doing so, had trained a mind to operate at the intersection of control, fear, and observation. She spent hours in those hidden veins following sound, discovering small cavities where messages or objects had been left, meticulously catalogued by Carter, preserved for his own perverse study of time and memory. When she finally emerged from the corridors, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the grounds, yet the echoes remained in her mind. She realized the house had not only recorded the suffering of its inhabitants, but had become a vessel for it, a living archive of fear. Walking away from the stairwell, she felt the pull of the walls behind her, as though the house itself resisted her departure, unwilling to relinquish secrets it had held for decades. Every shadow, every hollow echo became evidence of the systematic, patient cruelty Jonathan Carter had designed, and Sarah understood that the house was more than stone and timber. It was an extension of the mind that had conceived it, a structure of darkness where horror was not just enacted but encoded. By nightfall, she could no longer differentiate between memory and architecture, between the lingering echoes of the past and the palpable presence of evil pressing against her consciousness. The Carter house, she realized, had built a language of terror that survived long after its creator. A message carved into walls, whispered through corridors, and felt by anyone who dared listen. Sarah's exploration had brought her to the farthest wing of the Carter house, where the floorboards creaked in protest and the air smelled of old wood, decay, and something indefinable, metallic yet organic. Behind a false wall, she discovered a narrow doorway that led to a room unlike any other she had seen. The journals had hinted at its existence but had never described it fully, referring to it only as the ceremonial chamber. She stepped inside and was struck by the precision of its construction. The walls were lined with dark wood panels, meticulously polished, but each bore faint etchings, symbols, diagrams, and sequences that seemed to serve no decorative purpose, their meaning lost to time yet unmistakably intentional. In the center of the room was a circular platform raised slightly with indentations and channels carved into the floor, suggesting careful placement of objects or bodies. The journals described rituals that combined psychology, pain, and symbolic performance, and Sarah felt the air itself thick with these past actions. Candles, long since burned to stubs, were arranged in geometric patterns, their positions indicating not randomness but a calculated plan to influence perception, to focus attention, to manipulate the mind of those forced to participate. The journal entries revealed that Jonathan Carter had studied the effect of these rituals on both children and servants, noting how fear and anticipation could be harnessed to produce submission, obedience, or even breakdown. One passage described a servant tasked with walking the platform blindfolded while exposed to alternating sounds and scents meant to disorient, creating an environment where the mind would generate its own terrors. Another entry recounted the placement of small instruments that were not weapons in the conventional sense, but tools designed to apply pressure, heat, or cold to precise points, eliciting controlled reactions. Sarah felt a shiver as she traced the edges of the platform with her fingers, imagining the careful choreography required to execute each procedure. The room itself seemed to hum with memory, an invisible residue of ritual, a sense that the space had absorbed the intentions, the discipline, and the cruelty of its architect. She noticed faint stains on the wood, patterns that suggested the careful positioning of bodies over time, a meticulous recording of movement and response. The walls themselves appeared to participate in the work of observation. Subtle alcoves and slots hinted at hidden viewing points, confirming that the chamber had been designed to allow the orchestrator to remain unseen while controlling every detail. Sarah felt the weight of it pressing against her senses. The knowledge that each symbol, each indentation, each carefully placed candle had been intended to manipulate the human mind, to extract fear, to catalog suffering, to prove control. She shivered at a final detail, small notes pressed between panels describing the outcomes of each ritual. Carter wrote of moments when subjects experienced disorientation so complete that they forgot their own names. moments when servants or children began to speak only in whispered fragments, and moments when terror produced a form of obedience that was almost supernatural in its completeness. Sarah understood then that the house had not only been a site of cruelty but a laboratory of psychological domination, a stage on which Carter tested the limits of human endurance, will, and identity. As she left the ritual room, her mind raced with the realization that she had glimpsed the core of the Carter philosophy, that fear could be measured, recorded, and used as a tool, that the architecture of a home could serve as the extension of a mind bent on control. The ritual room was more than a chamber. It was a testament to methodical evil, a place where the invisible cruelty of one man had been enacted with terrifying precision, and where the echoes of suffering lingered long after the participants had vanished, leaving only the evidence of intention carved into the walls. As Sarah delved further into the Carter house's archives, the journals revealed a pattern that chilled her more than any hidden passage or ritual chamber could. The disappearances of children, never explained, never reported beyond the town's whispers, yet carefully recorded in Carter's methodical hand. The entries spanned decades, each beginning innocuously with the arrival of a new child under the pretense of apprenticeship, schooling, or simple caretaking, and ending with a quiet erasure from existence. One passage described how a young boy, only 8 years old, had been instructed to fetch firewood late one evening. He never returned, yet Carter noted clinically how the absence affected the remaining children. The subtle increase in obedience, the heightened wariness, the whispered tension that made them more malleable. Another journal entry recounted a girl left alone in the nursery with a device Carter had devised, a small contraption designed to produce sound and light in unpredictable patterns, creating a sensory maze that disoriented, terrified, and ultimately subdued. The girl's fear response was recorded in meticulous detail, her pulse, her breathing, her trembling hands, all noted as variables in an experiment of control. Sarah traced the notes and diagrams, her stomach nodding as she realized that the vanishing children were not accidents, nor acts of madness. They were components in a long, structured study of terror and human pliancy. Each disappearance left a residue in the house, echoes carried in the walls, floors, and hidden observation corridors. The house itself seemed to remember, pressing against the mind with faint whispers, footsteps, and the almost imperceptible brush of fabric across floors where no one walked. The journals suggested that Carter believed fear could be harvested, transformed into something beyond a simple emotional reaction, a force that could shape behavior, bend loyalty, and even fracture the sense of reality. Sarah felt a growing horror as she read how Carter had documented the effects of isolation, of incremental punishment, and of anticipatory dread, noting which children broke first, which adapted, and which vanished without a trace. One particularly grim note described a girl who resisted the manipulations. Carter observed her for days, recording every subtle defiance, before finally administering a punishment so carefully orchestrated that she disappeared from the household entirely. And yet her absence was catalogued as successful adaptation. Sarah's fingers trembled on the page as she absorbed the systematic nature of the atrocities. These were not impulsive acts of cruelty, but calculated, methodical erasures designed to study, control, and dominate. The vanished children were ghosts, lingering in the architecture, in the journals, and in the slow, suffocating atmosphere of the house. Even decades later, their presence could be felt. A tension in the air, a slight creak in the floor, a whispered sigh behind a door. Sarah's mind recoiled from the realization that she was walking in the same spaces where invisible victims had lived, suffered, and vanished, and that Jonathan Carter had built the house to ensure that every scream, every act of defiance, every shadow of resistance contributed to his understanding of fear as a tool. The horror was not only in the disappearances themselves, but in the cold, scientific lens through which they were viewed, as if the lives of children were no more than variables in a vast, orchestrated experiment. As she closed the journal, the house seemed to exhale around her, as though acknowledging her understanding of the depths it had contained. The vanished children were everywhere and nowhere, and Sarah knew that she had glimpsed the full extent of Carter's method. The invisible hand that could remove the most vulnerable, shape the minds of those who remained, and leave behind only echoes that would haunt anyone who dared to uncover them. As Sarah turned the brittle pages of Carter's journals, a new pattern emerged, one darker and more intimate than the vanishing children. The meticulous cataloging of his own family, tracing bloodlines, noting traits, weaknesses, and susceptibilities with a precision that bordered on obsession. Jonathan Carter had not only sought to control outsiders, but had turned his pathological curiosity inward, examining his own kin as if they were specimens under study. The journals detailed genealogies, recording every illness, every fleeting fear, and every unusual habit, linking them to an elaborate framework of potential ritual use. Sarah's eyes widened at the care with which he noted vulnerabilities, heightened anxiety, timidity, susceptibility to suggestion, and how he had designed subtle games, exercises, and trials to provoke responses in line with his experiments on control. One entry described a distant cousin brought to the house under the guise of a visit, who was subtly coerced into participating in a night-long observation. The cousin's every reaction to stress, confusion, and isolation was recorded and cross-referenced with other family members, creating a living map of inherited tendencies that Carter could exploit. Sarah traced her finger over sketches of symbols drawn on paper, each marking a person, a room, a device, a variable in his growing archive of fear. The rooms themselves were adapted to this purpose. Panels, hidden compartments, and observation points allowed him to manipulate situations with surgical precision. A controlled theater in which his own blood could be studied like test subjects. As she read, she discovered that the rituals he conducted on outsiders had been rehearsed on family first, ensuring that methods were perfected before exposure to the unwitting townfolk. There were notes about thresholds of despair, incremental disobedience testing, and obedience conditioning applied to children, cousins, and siblings. The meticulous cruelty was shocking in its normalization. For Carter, there was no moral boundary, only an experiment, only variables, only the extraction of responses from living humans. Sarah realized that his obsession with bloodlines was not merely genealogical curiosity. It was a compulsion to understand inheritance of fear, obedience, and resistance, and to manipulate those traits with precision. One entry chilled her completely. Carter speculated on the possibility of a perfect subject, one whose fear could be molded without breaking, whose obedience could be engineered across generations. Every note, every diagram, every observation reinforced that his home was not simply a house of horrors for strangers, but a laboratory of legacy where family, neighbors, and servants were all components in a long-term study of human compliance. As Sarah closed the journal, she felt the weight of this realization pressing down on her chest. The Carter house had been designed not just for terror but for inheritance, a place where evil was meticulously cultivated and recorded, ensuring its continuation. The shadows seemed thicker now, the creaks of the floors deeper, as if the house itself had absorbed and memorized every transgression, every manipulation, every secret, and now pressed them upon her in a silent, accusatory chorus. She understood with a clarity that made her stomach twist. The house was more than walls and timbers. It was a vessel for the ambition of one mind to extend through blood and time, encoding cruelty into lineage, crafting a legacy of fear that might outlast its creator. In leaving the room, she felt the gaze of generations unbroken, the echo of lessons passed down, and the oppressive sense that the secrets of bloodlines were as carefully guarded as the rituals themselves. A labyrinth of control extending beyond the visible, beyond the living, into history itself. Sarah's exploration of the Carter house had uncovered rooms, journals, and hidden corridors. But it was in the attic that the truth of silent observation became undeniable. The space was narrow, dusty, and suffocatingly quiet, yet she immediately sensed the design was intentional. Every beam, every slat in the floorboards, every tiny window seemed crafted to serve as a vantage point. Carter had not only studied behavior in his victims and family, he had ensured that someone, something was always watching, recording, noting. Small peepholes concealed behind panels and cracks in walls revealed vantage points into the central rooms and corridors below. The journals explained their purpose. The silent witnesses were intended to observe the impact of terror in real time, to catalog reactions not only in words but in physical posture, facial expressions, and involuntary movements. Sarah followed the path of the attic corridors, noting the faded markings that instructed viewers on what to focus upon, how to remain undetected, and how to note deviations from predicted responses. Carter had even designed tiny mechanical contraptions, whirring devices that could record subtle vibrations, pressures, or sounds, translating them into data he could analyze. The attic itself felt alive with memory. The air pressed upon her with the weight of countless unseen eyes. She imagined children huddled in corners, servants frozen in fear. Each movement noted by these hidden witnesses, each heartbeat a measurement in Carter's expanding ledger of control. One journal entry described a servant who, upon realizing he was being observed, unconsciously mirrored the gestures of the master, proving Carter's theory of learned submission. Another passage detailed a child who discovered a hidden slot too late, and the panic, the shame, and the terror had been used to recalibrate the parameters of future trials. Sarah realized with a cold clarity that these silent witnesses were not passive. They were extensions of Carter's mind, designed to ensure omnipresence, to create the psychological effect that no one could ever be truly alone, that every action might be anticipated, measured, and controlled. The concept of privacy, of sanctuary, was systematically dismantled in this house. Every room was monitored, every corridor a stage for calculated fear, and the attic provided the ultimate command center, allowing Carter to orchestrate events with an unseen hand. Sarah's pulse quickened as she considered the implications. The house had been built not only to terrify and manipulate, but to enforce observation as a weapon. Inhabitants lived under a constant, imperceptible scrutiny that shaped behavior before any action could even be contemplated. The terror was invisible, yet its imprint was indelible. She moved to a small window overlooking the main hallway, and the sense of being watched even now was almost unbearable. The silent witnesses had preserved their vigilance beyond their own lifetimes, leaving traces in creaking floors, in the lingering scent of candle smoke, in the very architecture that forced the living to perform, to comply, to act under constant surveillance. Sarah understood then that Carter's cruelty was amplified not merely by action but by observation. That to watch was to control, and to control was to immortalize terror. The house had been a theater, a laboratory, and a prison simultaneously, where the silent witnesses ensured that every scream, every hesitation, every instinctive shiver was a permanent part of the record. Stepping back from the window, Sarah felt the weight of centuries pressing down, the invisible witnesses still present, and the realization that the house had preserved their roles long after its master had vanished. Each beam, each slit, each hidden cavity was a testament to a mind that believed observation itself could become a form of domination, and that the victims, never knowing when, never knowing how, were always already prisoners of those unseen eyes. As Sarah traced the final corridors and hidden rooms of the Carter house, she began to understand the house itself as a living entity, not merely walls and beams, but an extension of Jonathan Carter's mind, perpetually reconstructing its own history. Every creak of timber, every warped floorboard, every hidden latch seemed to echo with purpose, as if the structure remembered what had occurred within it and reshaped itself to preserve those memories. The journals hinted at this phenomenon obliquely, with references to repairs and alterations that appeared almost ritualistic. Doors that were moved to manipulate movement, staircases that narrowed or widened to control pace, rooms that seemed to shift subtly over decades, ensuring that every new inhabitant encountered fear in a slightly altered form. Always unpredictable, always controlled. Sarah realized that the house rebuilt itself not with wood and nails alone, but with calculated psychological architecture, forcing anyone inside to navigate a maze of dread specifically designed for them. The mechanisms were subtle, hidden grooves in the floors that guided footsteps toward observation points, walls that amplified creaks and whispers, and doors whose hinges forced attention to the smallest sound, each adjustment measured, tested, and perfected across years of meticulous note-taking. The house became an instrument, and Carter its composer, orchestrating terror like a symphony, rebuilding the spaces not only physically but emotionally, shaping the perception of reality for every visitor, every resident. Sarah traced her fingers along the walls, sensing the invisible hands of history adjusting, shifting, ensuring that each corridor, each chamber, each stairwell retained the imprint of its purpose. Control, observation, fear. It was as if the house was alive, evolving over decades to perfect the experiments conducted within it, adapting to each occupant, learning from each scream and hesitation, storing these echoes in its architecture. and reshaping itself for the next generation of inhabitants. The journals described cases in which furniture had been deliberately repositioned, walls altered, and even floors replaced to refine the psychological pressure exerted upon those who entered. Sarah shivered as she considered that the house itself had become a participant in the cruelty, a silent co-conspirator, not merely preserving Carter's legacy but continuing it long after his death. Every corner, every shadow, every subtle draft of air seemed to insist upon awareness, forcing her to move carefully, deliberately, as if the house watched her, learning her patterns, calculating her reactions. She realized with mounting horror that this self-rebuilding nature made the Carter house uniquely insidious. It was not static, and its horrors were never the same twice, evolving to ensure that fear remained immediate, unpredictable, and inescapable. Walking through the final hallway, Sarah felt the oppressive weight of centuries of design pressing upon her, and she understood that the house's legacy was not merely its past atrocities, but its capacity to perpetuate them indefinitely. The structure itself, shaped by obsession, cruelty, and meticulous planning, had become immortal, a living record of methodical evil. She understood that her investigation was only a glimpse. The house would continue its work, adjusting, observing, and controlling any who dared enter. In that moment, Sarah realized the terrifying truth. The house was not only haunted by memories, but actively haunted by purpose, reconstructing terror for anyone who stepped inside, ensuring that the echoes of its architect's mind could never truly die, that his experiments were eternal, and that the building itself had become the final and most enduring witness to the depths of human cruelty. Sarah left the Carter house with a weight she could not shed, the journals and hidden spaces still etched into her mind as though the walls themselves had branded her memory. Outside, the town of Devil's Fork seemed unchanged, yet she understood that beneath the ordinary streets and modest homes lay echoes of the house's influence, faint but persistent, like a pulse that refused to die. She pored over historical records, comparing disappearances, mysterious illnesses, and unaccounted absences spanning decades, and a horrifying pattern emerged. Every so often, a new generation in the town experienced fear, loss, or manipulation linked in ways too precise to be coincidental. Jonathan Carter's obsession with bloodlines, control, and observation had left more than buildings and journals. It had left traces in the psyche of the town itself, subtle yet indelible. She found evidence that townsfolk had adopted certain routines, unwittingly echoing the practices Carter had engineered within his walls. Subtle obedience to authority, habitual avoidance of specific streets, inexplicable fear of certain rooms, and a nervous attention to the rhythms of neighbors' lives. The house had built more than terror. It had built legacy. As Sarah traced the lineage of Carter's family, she realized that descendants carried forward not only wealth or land, but patterns of manipulation, inherited habits of observation, control, and calculation, passing them subtly into the wider world. One record detailed a local school teacher whose quiet insistence on discipline mirrored Carter's methodologies. A distant cousin whose meticulous journals on students' behavior reflected the same obsessive note-taking, and a farmer who constructed barns with hidden compartments and secret passages, insisting on observation even where none was needed. The mechanisms of terror had migrated beyond the house, embedding themselves in ordinary lives. Sarah's sense of dread deepened as she recognized that evil had not ended with the master of the Carter house but had diffused through blood, environment, and social habit, creating a network of subtle influence that survived in silence. Yet within this recognition came clarity. Uncovering the truth, exposing the journals, documenting the hidden witnesses and self-rebuilding architecture offered a form of reckoning. By illuminating the darkness, by naming and understanding the mechanisms of fear and control, society could begin to recognize the signs, protect future generations, and confront inherited patterns before they repeated. Sarah's research would inspire local authorities to restore historical records, build memorials for those who vanished, and implement transparency in town governance, creating safeguards against manipulation and abuse. The legacy of the Carter house was no longer hidden. It was exposed to scrutiny, measured, and made accountable. And yet, a cold truth lingered in her mind. Evil had proven it could endure quietly, invisibly, in structures, in families, in traditions, in the very psychology of a community. Even as the town rebuilt its awareness and its history, the lessons of the Carter house whispered a warning that vigilance must persist, that observation must not become controlled, that silence could hide cruelty for generations. Sarah closed her notes, feeling both exhaustion and responsibility, the weight of uncovering an insidious mind pressing alongside the urgency of societal reckoning. The Carter house, the journals, the silent witnesses, the meticulously engineered fear, all remained as stark reminders that evil operates not only in acts, but in silence, in method, in inheritance, and that confronting it requires both courage and enduring attention. She understood as she walked away from the site one final time that exposure was the first step, accountability the second, and reflection the third, ensuring that even as the house persisted in memory and architecture, the town, the descendants and future generations might choose differently. Aware of the legacy of control that had once thrived in their midst, Sarah stood at the edge of Devil's Fork one last time, the wind carrying the scent of prairie grass and the faint remnants of smoke from the Carter house, which had since been cordoned off as a historical site. The house's legacy, carefully documented in her notes and the rediscovered journals, hung over the town like an invisible shadow, a reminder of the depth to which methodical cruelty could burrow, unnoticed for decades. As she reflected, she understood that the house was not unique. It was an extreme mirror of human capacity to hide darkness beneath normalcy, to engineer terror while maintaining appearances of innocence. Evil, she realized, often moved quietly, incrementally, leaving traces only those willing to scrutinize history could see. The town's efforts to memorialize victims, to create transparency and historical awareness, were steps toward redemption, yet they could never erase the psychological imprint left on those who had lived within the orbit of the Carter house. Sarah contemplated the psychology of Jonathan Carter, a mind so disciplined, so obsessive, so utterly detached from moral consequence, that he transformed architecture, observation, and ritual into instruments of enduring terror. The meticulous cruelty, the silent witnesses, the self-rebuilding house, all were evidence that evil did not always shout. Sometimes it whispered, lingered in walls, and infiltrated the human mind quietly, ensuring survival long after the master's death. In writing her report, she emphasized the importance of recognizing subtle forms of control in everyday life, of questioning inherited practices, of observing patterns that seemed ordinary but carried the echo of manipulation. The Carter house became both a warning and a case study, illustrating how methodical cruelty could survive generations, how it could shape behaviors, fears, and institutions without overt violence, and how accountability required both knowledge and vigilance. Standing before the town's newly established memorial for the vanished and forgotten, Sarah felt the weight of history pressing against her awareness. But she also sensed a fragile hope. Through exposure, understanding, and reflection, the patterns of silence could be disrupted, and future atrocities prevented. She considered the ethical responsibility of those who uncover such histories. Knowledge itself was a tool, and its careful application could honor victims while instructing the living. As she prepared to leave Devil's Fork, she paused, imagining the house as it had existed for decades, reshaping itself, observing, cataloging, adjusting its corridors of terror, and she felt a shiver not of fear but of respect for the precision of its construction. The lesson remained clear. Evil often operates quietly, systematically, and invisibly, yet it can be confronted when one observes carefully, documents meticulously, and reflects deeply. She left the town with her recordings, journals, and photographs, determined to share the story in full, knowing that exposure was the first line of defense against repetition. And as she gazed back at the horizon, the final thought lingered, meant to haunt those who would listen to her account. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could a mind, methodical, patient, and hidden, rise once more to shape fear into a living architecture? Sarah knew there was no simple answer. Only vigilance, reflection, and the commitment to ensure that silence does not become the accomplice of cruelty. The prairie wind carried her question into the distance, a reminder that history, observation, and conscience must remain awake, for the echoes of the past may yet resonate in the future.